Behind this and other threats abroad is Mike Gallagher, the chairman of the House Select Committee on China, Wisconsin congressman and former Marine serving 2 tours in Iraq. Congressman, good to see you. Thanks for joining me. I want to get your take. We're waiting for the third round of hostages to be released. There's been some debate. Obviously, the families want their family members back as hostages. Hostages want to go home. But there's some who said, listen, this is not the right strategy. You're giving Hamas space and time to regroup, reorganize, rearm, and then reattack. What's your take on the strategy of Israel?
Well, you can't help but be happy for the families. I'm sure if it were our kids, we would just be focused on wanting our kids back. So I understand that sentiment completely. I think the broader risk is this. Well, one, if you just look at the terms of the deal, for every 3 terrorists that Israel is releasing, you're getting 1 innocent civilian released by Hamas. So Israel is releasing suicide bombers, terrorists who were stabbing Jews, and Hamas is meanwhile releasing 13-year-old girls, 9-year-old girls, reportedly some toddlers. So that just goes to show there's no moral equivalence here. We've also had past deals like this, notably a 2011 deal whereby the current leader of Hamas in Gaza was released in return for an Israeli soldier that have come back to bite Israel. So that is the broader concern. There's no moral equivalence here, no matter how much #FreePalestine trends on TikTok. There's also the issue that Hamas reportedly has violated the terms of the ceasefire already. We were supposed to see the Red Cross visiting victims, for example. We haven't seen that. And then we know that Hamas is going to use these periodic releases of prisoners in order to drag out a temporary ceasefire to potentially a permanent ceasefire, which would be damaging to Israel's security. So I think we should look at this less as a diplomatic breakthrough and more as an extension of Hamas's psychological warfare designed to continue to increase the international pressure on Israel in pursuit of a permanent ceasefire. And that would be a bad outcome.
That would be a bad outcome. Congressman, I want to move on to China because we've seen the Chinese spy balloon. We see that they're buying American farmland. They steal our technology. But I want to talk to you about the secret biolab run by Chinese with ties to the CCP in Wheatley, California. How many of these secret biolabs exist around the country?
The honest answer is we don't know. And what worries me in doing this investigation, my committee conducted the investigation. We have a bipartisan report that explains the whole thing that Americans can read, is that if the FBI director or the president turned to the FBI director and said, hey, we need to figure out how many of these we have in the United States, they wouldn't even know where to begin. Here we had a Chinese citizen who came to America illegally. He was fleeing a $330 million judgment for intellectual property theft on behalf of the Chinese government. He set up this lab and he was buying dangerous pathogens, including Ebola, including tuberculosis, including HIV, online. So we have no tripwires in place, no safeguards in place in order to prevent potentially a hostile actor from buying dangerous pathogens in order to damage America. And then when the local officials found this, and it was all because a local business building inspector saw a pipe sticking out of what was supposed to be an abandoned building, they called the FBI. The FBI said, well, we can't investigate because there's no ties to WMD, which is absurd. They called the CDC. The CDC hung up on them initially, and it wasn't until the local congressman got on the case that the CDC was forced to send a team to investigate, and that wasn't until many, many months later. So this has revealed a huge soft underbelly in our domestic national security. It's incredibly troubling. We need to do more to prevent this from happening. We've all seen what can happen to our society when we don't have vigilance against potential pathogens and a pandemic in the last few years. And we know beyond anything else, the one thing that the pandemic should have taught us is that you cannot trust the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to this issue.
And what's the most outrageous part of the story is not just that you have a Chinese biolab in America, which, by the way, why would there be a Chinese biolab here? They can have as many biolabs as they want in China, but it's actually in this country. The fact that the CDC, Congressman, wouldn't go, of course, we're going to immediately, be on site the very next day to investigate how China could set up this lab, have these kind of bioweapons in the lab. Instead, they hang up the phone and the FBI refuses to investigate as well. It begs the question, did the CDC or the FBI actually know this lab existed? Is that why they didn't come in and investigate?
Well, based on our investigation, they did not know it existed until the local officials discovered it. So the local official, after seeing the pipe, went inside the building and saw a bunch of people in lab coats. Most of them were Chinese citizens, and there were all these vials that were labeled in Mandarin, eventually discovered to be even labeled Ebola or HIV. There was one case where there was a freezer. When the CDC finally did get there, there was a medical grade freezer, and inside were these sort of silver Ziploc bags. And because the bags themselves were not labeled Ebola, though the freezer was labeled Ebola, they refused to even test the sample. So even when they got on site, they refused to actually do their job. Again, it's incredibly troubling. And the guy who owned the facility claimed that he had a medical testing kit business, but it was fraudulent. He had fake pregnancy tests, fake COVID tests, and there's really no business reason for him to be buying pathogens online. And he was getting unexplained wire transfers from China. Over $2 million of unexplained wire transfers from China. Again, incredibly troubling. We have to do a better job of defending our homeland from a potential attack involving dangerous pathogens.
No doubt. I want to move on to this, Congressman, because the Pentagon has expressed concern about how China has expanded its ground satellites in South America to communicate with their satellites in space, giving them eyes almost up to the United States. This is a problem where the United States has forgotten our hemisphere. China has engaged. They've bought ports, mineral rights, and they're building relationships in our back turf. How concerned are you about the expansion of their presence in our hemisphere?
I'm incredibly concerned. It appears to me that after, a couple decades of neglect, we've allowed the CCP to turn the Monroe Doctrine into the Mao Doctrine. And we've had multiple reports. You referenced them buying up port facilities. In terms of the smart cranes that they own, they have something like 90% of the global market share. A lot of that is concentrated in our own ports as well as in ports in South and Central America. We had the report last year of a massive potential spy base to be located in Cuba, and then reports like the one you just referenced. And of course, this phenomenon of sort of pink or leftist red governments popping up all over our southern hemisphere. It's time that we pay attention to our own backyard. For a while, we just got complacent, right? We were lucky to have non-hostile neighbors. We had two oceans surrounding us, and we felt like we had this sense of security in our own backyard. The CCP is now exploiting that complacency in order to encroach on our territory, in my view, as part of an effort to undermine America and displace us as the global leader.
No doubt about that. All right, I want to come back closer to home. I want to go to your home district because the National Railroad Museum of Wisconsin in your hometown of Green Bay, for the seasonal Christmas tree display, they've allowed the Satanic temple tree, to be shown for the Christmas display. What's happening in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and what's the community's response to a Satanic Christmas tree in your community?
Well, thus far, the Railroads Museum's response has been insufficient. When parents and concerned citizens have contacted the Railroad Museum, they've said, well, this is an educational opportunity for kids, which is completely ridiculous, right? I think it's impossible to overstate how offensive this is to Christians. It would be in quite, a literal sense, the same thing as waving a Hamas flag inside of a synagogue. I mean, it's just absolutely crazy that we would allow this to happen. And the really shame of it is, Sean, every year the National Railroad Museum does something very interesting and cool and fun for kids, which is they do a big screening of Polar Express, and you're surrounded by all the trains, and it's a cool, fun thing to take your kids to. But now I wouldn't take my kids to it now. I don't want them to be surrounded by satanic trees. The local reporting has been insufficient, so the whole thing is absurd. And I would say one final thing. Conservatives are often accused of launching a culture war or focusing or fixating on cultural issues. But here is a perfect example of how that's not what's happening. What's happening is we're just trying to defend basic traditions or defend our children in the midst of these basic traditions from the encroachment of woke ideology or offensive, upside-down cultural propaganda. And so the whole thing is a shame. I thought that Northeast Wisconsin was at least immune to something that you might see in New York or California, but we need to be vigilant as parents.
Well, who would have thought that a museum would say this is an educational opportunity for children to see a satanic tree? It is outrageous. Hopefully more attention will be brought to this and more parents express outrage. Congressman Mike Gallagher, always a pleasure. Thank you for joining me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.